Yeah. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the special roundtable commemorating 60 years of Jazzfest Berlin. My name is Priscilla Layne. I'm a professor of German in the Germanic and Slavic department, and also director of the Center for European Studies, which is helping to support this event. And I first of all just like to thank, first our staff at the center, and also Sarah for helping out with all of the logistics. And I'd also like to thank our sponsors. So this is an event sponsored by the German Embassy in Washington, D.C., part of German Campus Week. It's something we do every year, events around German culture. And also Jazzfest Berlin, our second sponsor, in particular the artistic director, Nadine Deventer. The Jazzfest, the way this all started is the Jazzfest reached out to me because they were digitizing their archive of 60 years of programs, interviews, performances, and they put it all online and gave us access to these materials. So I'm really grateful for their support with that, and that we get to look at some cool, archival materials. So a little bit of information about the Jazzfest, just to give you some context. It started in 1964. During the 60s and 70s, it was considered the most important jazz festival in Europe and the most significant jazz fest outside of the U.S. Prior to its first official festival, it was also called the Berliner Jazztage or Berlin Jazz Days, curated by the inaugural director, a man named Joachim Ernst Behrendt, a very famous scholar of jazz music. He wrote a book called The Jazz Book. So that's how, authoritative his views on jazz were. And he did an interview in the 90s about his history with jazz that I thought was really interesting. He talks about, for example, playing a jazz station when he was a prisoner of war in a Soviet camp. So, at the end of World War II, 1943, he had a jazz station. So to me, that shows, just the kind of universal draw that jazz has had for many, many decades, that it's able to unite enemies, right, Germans and Russians. But also at the time he mentioned the music he played in Russia, we wouldn't have heard on German at the time in the 40s under the Nazi regime. So in particular, in German history, we see this struggle around national identity, often related to music. What is considered German music? Is jazz German enough? Is it too foreign? Questions like that. Now, Behrendt, one of the reasons he is well known is because he helped make jazz, I'd say, respectable in the 1950s. Prior, if in the 30s, people thought of jazz as, fringe, subversive, if you think of swing kids, if you thought about those kinds of subcultural groups. In the 50s, it was, helping people understand, people who are, really serious about music, interested in composition and craft, could also see jazz as an important genre. And in particular, during the Cold War, jazz kind of was a symbol of cultural democracy. So the U.S. government would spend money for American jazz artists to go and play in Germany. There are these America houses throughout Germany where they would, have jazz on display. So for the U.S., jazz became a symbol of American diversity and a testament to the idea that democracy, it's democratic, the multicultural nation is successful, and thriving. So a little bit more about the festival. So in his jazz book, Behrendt states that what sets jazz apart from other musical styles emerging from Europe is its tension. So he says, in the climate created by jazz, and here I'll quote him, the emphasis is no longer on great arts of tension as in European music, but on a wealth of tension-creating elements which continuously rise and fall. So according to that interview with Behrendt, so he left the festival, I believe, in the 70s. And he says what made him believe is the bad press that it got in Berlin. And speaking with Nadine Deventer, one of the things the festival has faced is kind of tension with the local jazz fans. So historically, there haven't been a lot of Berlin musicians who performed there, and that caused a bit of tension. But in this case, Barrett was talking about the fact that the press often like to stress the bad behavior of the musicians. So when they would report on the festival, they wouldn't talk about all the different styles represented. They'd say like, oh, this trombonist got really drunk, and was acting crazy, right? And arguably that might have something to do with stereotypes about Black musicians, Black men, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later. So just to wrap up, I want to mention that, you can go to the next slide. Two things I want to mention next. So here, there's a festival a website for the festival that you can go to at address. And actually, you can see the program and also several articles that scholars have written, invited to reflect on the 60 years. And I wrote an article about George Gruntz, who's a Swiss jazz scholar and musician, and he took over for Barrett in the 70s. And then the next slide. Another thing to think about is the different people who were the director of the festival. So you'll see that from its beginning in 1964 until 2018, it's been all white men. And now, since 2018, Nadine Deventer is the festival, so the first female artistic director of the festival. And just to give you a little background of her, she studied European studies with music in Paris, Amsterdam, and Berlin. For at least 20 years, she's been active as a curator, dramaturg, and project director in various contexts in the cultural arena. Let's see. And under her artistic leadership, the Jazzfest Berlin was nominated Festival of the Year in 2020 and 2022. So now that I've given you a little bit of background on this festival, I'll introduce our panelists. I'll keep these short so we can get to the questions. So first we have Andrea Bohlman, your instructor, who you already know, but for those of us who are joining us on Zoom, is an associate professor of music here at UNC. A lot of her work builds on her expertise on music in Central and Eastern Europe, cultures of protest, and everyday histories of sound recording. And she has a monograph from 2020 called Musical Solidarities, Political Action and Music in Late 20th Century Poland. Then we have Adi Nestor here in the middle, an assistant professor of German, and the Levine Split Fellow in Jewish Studies here at UNC. Her book, Unsettling Difference, Music, Drama, the Bible, and the Critique of German Jewish Identity, is slated to appear with Cornell University Press this winter. And finally, we have Jonathan Wipplinger, who is our guest from out of state, an associate professor of ancient and modern languages, literatures, and cultures at the University of Wisconsin, Milwaukee. I see you didn't mention your book, which is literally on jazz in Germany. But the title, I think, was
The Jazz Republic.
The Jazz Republic. So yeah, he wrote this great book called The Jazz Republic, looking at the reception of jazz during the 1920s in Germany, and communication between Germans at the time and African Americans. So yes, I'm very excited to hear from our esteemed panel. And I want to share with Adi a question for you. So in the jazz book, Joachim Barrett describes jazz as, and I'll quote it here, a form of art music that originated in the United States through the confrontation of African Americans with European music. So Adi, I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about what this term art music means. So Kunstmusik in German, what is its historical significance, and what would it mean for him to say that jazz art music?
Okay, we're starting with the philosophical.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure that you guys have been discussing what is considered art music a lot in classes such as these. So like maybe my contribution will be just an perspective on this. And I guess I could sort of try and tie particularly to kind of like band endeavors to situate jazz as a form of music, or as an art music. So when we think about, concert music would be another term, right? Music that people, music that dress up. In an evening, when you go to a concert hall and pay $100 for a ticket, at least the day, yawn, or not. So that's it, that's somewhat far away, or some people would say, from the experience of living in jazz. And I think these are kind of like the conceptions that been addressed, right? And we think of a form of music that is not what we think of, like those are like the North Carolina Symphony and the Imperial Symphony, like Beethoven, for example. But that would still be considered a part. And so some of the criteria when he kind of starts to write a definition for what is jazz, right, which in itself is a challenge. Kind of the criteria are addressing what he understands as art music, right? As what we normally attribute to concert music, or so-called classical music, or art music, classical music, all of these terms of problematics and themselves. And one of the kind of main things that he tries to hone in on is this idea of its genius, basically, right? There's an element of originality, right? If we think about popular music, and again, these are all kind of terminologies that we can all kind of challenge that we engage with. But when we think about popular music, we're thinking about maybe formulas, right? With slight variations. So where's the originality? Where is that kind of creative spark of genius in jazz, right? I think these are some of the things that are really kind of important. And I don't know how much detail do you want me to get into?
I thought it'd be really great. Actually, on a related note, Jonathan, your book engages in thinking also about how Germans think about blackness, race, and how that contributes to their reception of jazz. So I was wondering what Adi said about jazz, barbaric jazz. It's creative, it's original, there's genius. I'm wondering, for those Germans who didn't see that sort of thing in jazz, to what extent does that have to do with race? And just to give you an example, so in this interview with Bandland, when he's talking about how the Berlin press was really negative, he gives us an example of this genius tenor saxophonist who was playing at the festival, but he got really drunk, and so the press was like, male violence in Berlin. That was like the headline. So can you talk a little bit about, I guess, how race intersects with this German reception of jazz?
Absolutely. I think, not to bring it back to a period prior to the 1960s that we're dealing with, but where jazz first emerges in Germany are in sites of entertainment, sites where people would go to drink, and where they would go to dance too. And these were popular musicians who were performing maybe alongside an evening of entertainment, which could have included other musical acts, but then also maybe a variety theater setting. And very early on, Blackness and Black American, primarily male, but not always, performers were associated with jazz immediately in the 1920s, even if, let's say, the artists they saw were white. So you'd have white jazz artists, white German, but also white American who would be performing there. And the role of Blackness as both belonging not to the concert hall, right? This right in the 1920s. And then jazz as being a popular music and not European and not elite music, all kind of, I think plays an important role in how it is received. Now, this, despite the fact that there were jazz performances in concert halls prior to there in Germany and elsewhere. And one of the things that I talked about in terms of Barrett really focusing on putting jazz in dialogue with elite European art music. I was just reading about his insistence that the performers wear kind of formal evening dress. So this was, I think part of that visual that belonged with that sphere, and that to have kind of any other attire would not be befitting of the music that had this genius. The other thing I would say too about maybe where Baron maybe distinguishes himself in some ways from earlier is that jazz was kind of also a universal music, and I think this is important that it was part of the ideology of the art music is that it is universal and not nationally specific, although Germans want to claim that particular role in having created that.
If I can just interject just a very small comment, I think it's very interesting when you're kind of reading some of Dan's comments of jazz to see that he's a little bit conflicted in my mind. On the one hand, he tries to sort of establish jazz as this sort of like respectable art form, but at the same time, there's like things, as you say, Jonathan, of saying jazz is universal, it's democratic, right? So there's kind of like this back and forth of all of these elements that he's trying to like balance and put together.
And Andrea, what did you prefer? Andrea, I'm curious, you looked at like the later programs. So I could definitely see there being a lot of like respectability politics in the 60s, especially I think the civil rights movement and the way that African Americans are trying to position themselves in society. What about the later years? Like, what did you notice about how the festival engages in Black culture with Black culture? I'm curious if a more like essentialist understanding emerges, or if the festival program kind of like accepts like the multifaceted nature of Black culture.
It's a really interesting question. What from year to year, how coherent is the kind of message that the festival is sending? Because in some ways, I would say that there are concepts from the early years that really seem to me to sing into the present, like the idea of genius figures or influential figures. So it's really interesting, like I read about 25 years of the festival's programs, really tracing through, also the politics of the last 8 years, which maybe we all can reflect on, like as musicians, how the politics about making music and musical accessibility have changed in the United States during that time. Because one of the things I see in the early 2000s is there's a real sense of ode to the American jazz masters from the 50s and the 60s. So it's almost like there's a constant knitting to the past. So that means John Coltrane, that means Thelonious Monk. There's one evening where there's like an attempt to cover all of Thelonious Monk's compositions in one concert. So there's like a blitz version in the early 2000s where you're just bombarded with 66 hours of music compressed into one. And but then by last year or 2 years ago, you get Alice Coltrane as the referent of the past genius, or you get in 2002 this very influential Black composer and performer, improviser George Lewis was like the renegade outsider, and now he's kind of like one of the central figures of the festival. So in some ways, like cutting across, there's this kind of notion of Black excellence as renegade, and then as it ages, right, as a category, right, it becomes this sort of genius that can be mapped onto maybe even respectability politics. I don't want to say that about Alice Coltrane necessarily, but I think getting back to your question and sort of this idea of like what's happening in the last 25 years, I would actually get back to this sense of like where does it happen and what are the spaces and who are the ideal audience members. So in the 2000s, people are writing about things like, oh, jazz fans. There's an idea of who jazz fans are and what they know. And what they know is lots of albums. They know they have references to like particular live recordings. In jazz history, there's the idea that an album represents a live space. So that you buy an album because it's like you were in the Lower East Side in 1954. And so a lot of the concerts try to recreate that liveness that's mediated. That's one of the things we get talked about a lot, is how all of these things are always mediated. But you really see a change in the venues over the time. So actually, in a way that I would say is analogous to what I see on this side of the Atlantic, is more sites that are coded as part of multicultural Berlin, as sites where the concerts happen. So like now you'll have in like some of the more industrial areas, or in Kreuzberg, you'll have post-industrial spaces where the jazz festival happens. There are art centers, and not just these like kind of pivotal centers and concert halls of the immediate post-war era of West Berlin. So even though there are still big concerts that happen there. So I think that one of the things that you have doing is kind of reinforced center and periphery, and you see kind of conceptions of like race and music refracted along those lines a little bit, you know.
I wanted to look at one of the quotes that you sent to me, Jonathan, so you can a couple slides of it's yes, this one. So you can make this quote. This was included in the first program from '64. I translated it. I'll just read the translation. There are N-words and slaves and N-word slaves everywhere in the world. But jazz didn't happen anywhere else, only here in the country. Jazz isn't especially African. Rabbis in the synagogue and G words sound more like jazz than anything in Africa. If Charlie Parker had been born in China, he would have become a great musician there. I'm sure of it, but he hadn't had any bebop. So, Jonathan, can you just tell us who Lenny Tristano is, and what did you find interesting about this quote?
A lot. One of the things, I believe this is I'm trying to sort of visualize. So what we have to do is understand that this is 1964. This is the first now then called the Jazz Days, Berlin Jazz Days. And this might be the second page of the program. And let's put this into context. The third page is a letter in English by Martin Luther King Jr. Right? So we have this, I think, shocking and controversial quotation, controversial in point of fact at the time. So Lenny Tristano was a white American jazz musician, and sort of best known in the 1940s, late 1940s, early 1950s, highly experimental, was kind of mixing atonal serial music with jazz, and also using kind of tape manipulation and overdubbing, so highly avant-garde, but never found an audience, found his way, at least as far as he felt. And so the quote here, I tracked this down, comes from a 1962 article. So it's also interesting that Behrens was quoting him a little over a year later, and it's called Lenny Tristano Speaks Out from Downbeat, really important jazz periodical of the period. And Tristano was known for giving controversial opinions. And the context here is that essentially he's, again, he's reached his peak in the early 50s, late 40s. He's now active as a teacher. He's no longer really in demand. And he's sort of asking himself, well, what could it be? Hint is going to be, he blames it on the fact that he's white. He says, and here's a quote that's not contained here, but he says it's a curious thing that everyone forgets we did it, but after all, we were white. And these sorts of discussions about race and jazz and white critics and also white musicians are also at the heart of one of the things that Behrens is balancing out here. And I think one of we can read this along a number of paths. I think for Tristano, I think it's simply a skewed justification of why he never became as famous or as portrayed or any other artist, right? Just simply, I'm the real genius, recognize me. So why does Berendt though quote it? That's sort of another question. I think one, it helps Berendt to present from an American perspective, a white American perspective, the idea that jazz is an American music that is formed through encounter. That is sort of a music that is not for Berendt African American. It's not a Black music, but rather it's an American music. And this is important for Berendt. Why? He's a white German, and he really wants to engage with this music and wants to engage with jazz outside of the United States. I think the Tristano quote helps him to emphasize that jazz is about creating tensions and encounter, and then that also opens it up to further encounters between himself and Europe. I dug further though, because I think it's also important. So a few years after this quotation, Amari Baraka, who's extremely important Black American author, interviewed Archie Shepp, another extremely important jazz activist and artist in the period. And 3 years after, Shepp recalls this interview that Berendt quoted from. So I want to read a little bit of what Archie Shepp said in response to this. So he said, so far, I don't think the majority of white jazz musicians realize their function in jazz. They haven't found what their true roots are. They haven't dared to go back to their own roots. I read an article about Lenny Tristano in Downsheet where he made some brief statements, very shocking, almost racist, if I can use that word. And then he says, but for a man to have that much gall, especially a white man, playing music which has been given to him rather graciously, in light of that impression, I think that man should be rather respectful with his words, especially when he's criticizing the giver of a gift. A marvelous gift. So that's Shepp in 1965, responding to Tristano's statement, bringing it back to Berendt and the Jazzfest. Both Tristano and Shepp performed at the Jazzfest. So it's again this tension that is always unresolved in terms of race, in terms of musical style, that Berendt kind of doesn't really want to take a stance on. He just wants to present it, well, it's all jazz, and I'm not going to wade into the sectarian battles with him. He wants to stand outside.
Yeah. Which maybe he sees as being eager because he's German. Like, oh, these Americans who are arguing about race, outside of that. That's really interesting. Thank you for bringing in Shepp's response. Because for me, it's interesting to hear that in 65, Shepp was already saying, this is a racist statement. Because for me, seeing this language in the text, was very shocking.
Yeah.
And I feel like today, the festival would never print a quote like this. So it's also interesting to think about how, German engagement with this kind of excitable speech has changed over time. I wanted to come back to you, Avi. So specifically thinking about the language that Tristano was using here about slaves, slaves created this music. It makes me think of Adorno's views on jazz, why he hated it, in the 30s. And I was wondering if you could, just give us an idea, what was Adorno's big problem with jazz in the 1930s, and did his views change at all by the 50s? I know him and Berendt kind of got into it, back and forth in a magazine. Can you enlighten us on that topic?
Maybe first of all, a couple of words of who Adorno is. I don't know how many people have heard this name in the class. I think that, we have some people nodding. Great. If you continue your music studies, I hope that you will run into that name at some point. So Adorno is a cultural critic. He lived in I would say the first half of the 20th century. Died in the late 60s. He was half Jewish. He emigrated to the United States during the Second World War. And he is notoriously known for his kind of like very scathing critique of almost anything, of any cultural object whatsoever. Nothing kind of like escapes his his critical purview. And so Adorno himself is kind of like informed by a very long tradition of German philosophy, even though he's engaging very critically, like distances himself from that tradition. And if I could just like tie that again to give just a little bit of context, tie that to this idea of genius again, and to the kind of notion, particularly of genius that is shaped throughout the 19th century primarily. In German thinking. And that in itself, I feel like I have to go and talk about this. I need to go back a little bit. So if I could just like say one word about Kant. The German philosopher of 18th century, again, orienting ourselves. And Kant actually gives us already a definition of genius in his third critique, that already kind of like encapsulates the kind of like the problem of genius. And he comes up with this concept called exemplary, exemplary, excuse me, exemplary exceptionality. I think I might be messing this up. The idea is that how can we sort of like identify genius, right? Genius, on the one hand, is we kind of are approaching what later becomes a kind of like a romantic idea. Genius is something that defies all rules, right? But there's got to be a way to sort of like identify what is genius and what is just like nonsense, right? So there has to be some sort of like tension between following some rules and defying rules, right? So the idea of exemplary originality, that was the term. Exemplary originality is that it's something that defies any rules, but it provides a model for imitation, right? So that in itself is a paradox, right? Because if it defies all rules, then why are we copies of it? And so this tension can then manifest in different ways throughout the 19th century in writings of different characters, right? It could be perceived as the tension between spirit and technique, for example. And in music, this is very palpable, right? When you think about technical performance versus the spark of originality, you can sort of like find this kind of like typology of a composer versus performer, even. And there are all kinds of German authors working dealing with this. E.T.A. Hoffmann, another name that hopefully we will run into at some point, engages with it in his own kind of literary writing a lot. Right? He has a story called The Automata that it talks about automaton stuff like instruments, right? This kind of like anxiety that the art that is supposed to be like the most spiritual is actually kind of very much technical. And this goes on and on. And so the idea of genius as it is shaped throughout these writings is also informing Adorno. But when Adorno is writing in the 20th century, he's already kind of distancing himself from this, and he says, well, this idea of genius is this ideology, right? It's basically genius, like this idea of something that defies all rules, something that is completely free of any kind of constriction or any kind of formula, right? That's not really possible. And when he comes to jazz, and he is aware of people. I mean, Behrend is much younger, right? So when Adorno is writing in the 1930s, his essay on jazz, he's still not aware of Behrend particularly. They have their brush in the 1950s. But when he comes to write about jazz, there's already kind of like this claim, right? That jazz is this new spark of genius, right? Where maybe classical music is kind of like run its course. That would be, an argument. Jazz is like the new place where freedom can be found, right, in art, because of it's improvisatory, democratic nature. And Adorno is kind of like looking to debunk this. And it's an essay that I do not want to defend because everybody who reads it kind of like the hair bristles. But at the same time, I also don't want to kind of completely dismiss all of his claims. Adorno says that basically everything that that jazz is supposed to do, to reflect this kind of freedom, is ideology again. I mean, the syncopation, the kind of like dislocation of the rigid beat in itself is not really freedom. That's an argument that he's responding to, right? It's basically, he says, it only enforces the stricture of beat, right? Because you have to know where the beat is, right, in order to syncopate. And the same thing with improvisation. You have to have a theme, right? So you're basically working off. This is, very much, very in a nutshell, without getting too much into the theory. And Barrett kind of picks that up, and Adorno kind of reiterates this in the early 50s on the pages of the Four, which is one of the kind of like most significant journal in the German space of cultural criticism. And Barrett responds to that and in a way has this duel with Adorno. And he kind of again tries to reinforce this idea of jazz as a democratic art form. And one of the claims that he brings is that it is a Black form of expression, specifically, right? He says you cannot ignore that. Whereas when you read Adorno it seems to be sort of like sidestepping it. I'm thinking about it in terms of today, and that would be like, Leibniz and, all lives matter, right? And you don't want to like reduce, Adorno's basic thing, you don't want to reduce, this art form and the people who are, this is attributed to, you don't want to reduce them to this particular aspect of their identity, right? This is where Adorno is coming from. Whether that's defendable, I don't want to defend that. I just want to say one thing though, is that although Adorno is mostly kind of like shunned for his writing on jazz, there is an assistant professor, a Black scholar at UC Berkeley, who's recently published a kind of reconsideration of Adorno's writing on jazz. And she does a very interesting thing. In German, there's this term called Rettung, which means saving or salvaging. And that's something that, it's a concept in critical things in the particular cultural criticism that people like Adorno are engaging with, where you look at a cultural object and through critique, you actually suss out its own kind of like revolution potential in a sense, right? And I think what Fumiuchi is doing for Adorno is exactly that kind of veteran. In a sense, she's kind of like building on this idea, on this kind of like, she doesn't really refer to Barrett much. It comes up in the book, I think maybe once passing, but she does kind of build on this kind of conflict of like whether you can reduce an art form to a particular aspect of an identity or not, which is basically what it seems to be like the kind of point of contention, one of the points of contention between Adorno and Barrett. And she said exactly this contradiction, right? That jazz in a sense embodies, right? This idea that you can and you cannot at the same time reduce it. This is the kind of like the revolutionary potential. Like this is the only place where you could see something really kind of critical about jazz, right? The fact that it kind of like exposes this. And she's an Adornian thinker. This is the way that Adorno himself is engaging with works of art, right? He's not looking for utopias, which is what Barrett is looking for. Barrett is like, jazz is perfect. That's like the gift, the God's gift, to the humans of the 20th century, right? That's our salvation. And Adorno is like, no art form can be that, not even classical music. And again, even that kind of like fight between Adorno and Barrett is jazz, Kunstmusik, is it art music or not? I mean, it's not for Adorno, it's not really the question, right? Because even art music is subject to that same kind of problem, right? I mean, you cannot show a perfect word with art, not today, for Adorno. And the only thing that you can do is show conflicts, pictures, and fragments.
Well, staying with the idea of is jazz free from freedom or not, I want to direct to you, Andrea. But since you work on social movements and music, I was wondering, when we think about this period after '64, after the festival started, to what extent did jazz play a role in something?
Yeah.
I don't know, maybe in the East it was more so the case. And also when you compare it to Poland, and you and I were talking a little bit about the importance of jazz in Poland, like how do they compare?
Yeah.
Like what jazz in Poland and was like against the country, the regime support it.
Yeah. I think it's really interesting set of maybe tensions between what does it mean for something to have a politics that you can articulate abstractly, like democracy, freedom, or rebellion, resistance, right? And what are the kind of emotional registers associated with those different politics? And then what does it mean to say it has a politics in the sense that it can be used? We talked a little bit about cultural diplomacy, but that it depends on money to support and state media. And so it's interesting that Jazzfest Berlin considers itself the most important jazz festival in Europe in the second half of the 20th century, because I think the Polish Jazz Jamboree, which predates this 1956, Miles Davis performed at Jazz Jamboree in Poland, would make the same claim, which is not invalidate either claim, because it's really important to remember at this time that there was a sense of immobility from east to west in Europe, and that these were two different scenes. And where you might be able to see something very similar in East German lineage jazz genealogy back to the bars and concert stages and big bands of interwar Germany, East and West, Poland, Prague, Czechoslovakia, Austria, they would all share a similar lineage to this kind of big band, but also social dance hall tradition. That really splits along the political differences in the post-war period, in the Cold War. In Polish context, musicians generally used a really cute, effective political trick, where they said music has no meaning, no political meaning, and they escaped. That's the term they would use. A lot of the political censure that theater, especially literature, and visual arts, which are seen to have more representational politics. And that's what we're getting at here when we're talking about identity, race, and like meaning. We're talking about what is representation doing for the art form. So they basically told the Music Association was like, no, I mean, there's no words, so there's no politics here, right? This is a blatant lie, and I mean, I don't mean lie in the sense that I don't think that there is some truth to it. It's that they understood that this was a strategy, a political strategy, which I think is different than someone like Barron, who is investing in the core truth to the like everyone gets a solo, so everyone's equally important as a creator. That seems to me a simplification. Whereas saying like, oh, you're going to censor words, well, we're not going to use words. But what this does is it conditions like a whole different historical response. That we listened last week to like Peter Brunsman, who's this incredibly politically articulate, he explicitly makes a connection between his performances and what it means to be making art in Germany in a time of a century of violence, right? And he brings that violence into his body when he makes the music. In a lot of the legends of Polish jazz, there's actually an attempt to create a kind of what we might hear as like a chill atmosphere or a slow minimalist space. So it really countered and really like sort of non-intrusive art form. And I don't think that's because there was freedom. I think there's a lot of different aesthetic decisions that go into that. But it's really interesting to see that person and someone who was involved, that Barrett was involved in recruiting and kind of promoting through the Cold War, who's a trumpeter named Tomasz Stanko, but he's affiliated more broadly with Polish post-war jazz, and I'll talk a little bit about that in a second. But they're both eras of Jazzfest Berlin, like for decades. And they also both play at Jazz Jamboree in Warsaw for decades. So there's a kind of reciprocity of both the kind of angular, fractured, like in crisis sounding jazz, like the chaos, we talked about that sounding a little bit like that, and jazz sounding soothing, supportive, beautiful, maybe, slow. Those things both needed to exist. And you see that even in the present, like in the last couple of decades of the festival, there's kind of all the balance between like Scandinavian jazz, which is also a very minimalist jazz aesthetic, will come and appear, and it's really important to kind of nurture that strand or that subgenre or of jazz. But I think it's interesting to think about. I feel like some of these early conversations about establishing jazz in Germany really do they do sacrifice some of the international kind of circuitry of jazz that's going on at the time. I think it's really important to note that someone like Berendt, through using television programming to cast the light on jazz scene, and think about jazz in terms of scenes, like jazz scene in Krakow, which is a lot of Polish Jewish musicians making jazz together, modeling themselves, like explicitly they're referencing like Ornette Coleman, right? They're talking about New York, they're talking about like they're making some similar comments about like an awkward relationships to like history of enslaved people. And but those ensembles, they end up becoming really important in film scoring. And actually, a lot of those people end up moving to Hollywood and score film tracks for Hollywood production. So that's a way in which the Berlin Jazz has this kind of other circuitry going on. That's not just like serving the city of Berlin or serving the political ideology of the Cold War, but a broader sense of like how jazz moves through things like just like literal availability of money and these high-powered arts institutions. I think that's something that like, yeah, I think that's something important, like pragmatic and materialist to put on the table as part of the history of. I guess we can talk about social movements. Sorry, I didn't really explain.
That's okay. Give you some time for the students' question. So those of you on Zoom, the students in this class submitted some questions prior to the event. So we wanted to hear some of them and see what you all had to say in response. So yes,
So I have the questions that I just took, and I would say this: if I'm asking your question and you want to hear a little bit more, do feel free to raise your hand or clarify. One person wanted to talk a little bit more about like the different locations of the festival, both in the city, but also the different material, like the program and some of the radio interviews and stuff like that, and how that impacts like who the listeners are at the jazz festival, and like doesn't necessarily need to be like a historical overshoot, but I think that's the question: is like who are the listeners and what are the musicians like? Yeah, what about the musicians? How much control do they have over that? I don't know if anyone knows.
yeah.
I'll say a little bit about just not necessarily historical overview, but about the situation in 60. That was something that I picked up on. Number one, this is a highly mediated event, meaning there are radio broadcasts, there's television broadcasts, there are sponsors of airlines that getting paid for the artists to come over. One of the people we haven't talked about is American George Line, who ran the Newport Jazz Festival. And that was another example of how this is linked into a larger circuit of jazz performance, really across the globe. And sometimes, sort of maybe someone needed a gig, and so Line would help Berendt or help them get a job at the Jazz Festival. And then that could create kind of frictions also. there were also multiple spaces where it was performed from the beginning. There were workshops, there were parties. And then there were also anti Jazz Days festivals that were organized, where people who didn't see themselves, especially like modern free jazz in the 60s, would organize a counter festival because they opposed the vision. So it's a whole ecology and economy that's going on. So yeah, absolutely. I think that's essential to think about. And also big time sponsors. Coca-Cola is a consistent sponsor of this festival
Yeah.
throughout.
I think we have a couple of ads from Coca-Cola, just so you can get a.
Oh, on the slides. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
There we go. Yeah. Some examples of that advertising. Braun, which is a huge German company.
So yeah, technology, musical reproductive technologies, as well as instruments, but the Coca-Cola one, which was a concluding advertising, so they paid extra for that, was consistently the first few years.
I'll also say about location in the city. So Berlin is a unique city in the sense that every neighborhood is different. Like every neighborhood has a history, might be associated with, like there's one neighborhood, Kreuzberg, we find a lot of Turkish, Germans. Then there's like Charlottenburg, which is really the fancy, upper class. So I think also having different locations, you might draw from different places. Like there are parts of Berlin that some Berliners will be like, I don't go to that neighborhood, right? So I think depending on which audience you're hearing for, you take a particular locale.
Yeah, it's like sometimes Carolina Performing Arts will, like those ones is something that's critical, right? And that's
Right.
probably not gonna be.
Yeah, exactly, right.
Or if it's there, then they'll also be.
Mhm.
Yeah, someone else asked a question about the marginalized place of women. And yeah, and a little bit sort of like what has the festival done, especially in recent years. But like also what is the repercussion of like kind of, yeah, casting women as making women's jazz. Yeah, what is it like? Is it possible for women to also just be there?
Yeah. I thought about this big question of gender too, when you were talking about who are the jazz fans that the program is kind of speaking to. And you talked about the fans who like have certain albums, like know the discography. I wondered to what extent that thinking of jazz fans in that way includes women to a certain extent. So doing my own research on subculture, I mostly work on like punk and ska and reggae. And I'll say also as a punk myself, in my teens, I was never the person who would memorize all the people in the band or like the order in which the album. Like I just didn't care with that. And often that would cause conflict. If I ever talked to men about music, they just automatically assumed I didn't know anything if I didn't know this album came out in like 67, right? And not 69 or something. So to what extent, did any of you notice anything about women's, like the space that women are given in the festival? This was an article I came across where a woman is just arguing like women need to have more of a role, we need to respect their unique voice in jazz and also support women, I think. Yeah. Jonathan or Andrea, either of you want to say in particular?
The infrastructure in the 60s, unsurprisingly, is exclusively male in terms of who's writing the programs, who's organizing it, who are all those main figures at the front. There were a series of women singers and women as part of performance groups, but in a very, very small minority. So it was simply not a question that they really, that I can recall, deal with.
One example that I brought for the class to see, if you can go back a couple slides to the video, an embedded video clip. So this is, I brought just a couple minutes of the performance by an African American, jazz singer, Sarah Vaughan. And this, I'll say really quickly before we hear it, there was some like controversy around her performance. So in George Gruns's autobiography, he was the second artistic director. he says that when she performed, people felt the way she was dressed didn't reflect like what they expected from jazz. Like it was too fancy. He called it a ball guide, like an evening gown. And after this, there was another Black female artist where he called her before her performance and was like, "What are you going to wear?" And she got really offended, like, "I'll wear what I want to wear," you know. So this whole like policing around performance and gender, I think, but yeah, if you can play that really quick.
Oh,
Oh,
sorry, unexpected.
oh, is it maybe it's having a word? So this makes me think of the kind of jazz you would describe it, Andrea. Like soothing, beautiful, right? As opposed to the other where I am.
Yeah, and just to quickly add on, and maybe I can bring in another question here, is someone wrote, how has the conduct of genre served not just as a reactionary tool or something to fight over, but as a force that has shaped new musical movements? One of the things that this is maybe to start, then go back to that reactionary mode is, I noticed that there's a lot of sort of concerts featuring women performers, especially vocalists. So there's kind of what women are allowed to do, and it's maybe more systemic than necessarily at the jazz festival itself, right? That this is a space with one that there's more support or fan demand or whatever for women. There was so you have a lot of vocal performances. I was listening to an album by Miharu Koshi, who was brought in a year when they collaborated with the Japan Foundation to bring a lot of the Japanese jazz scene, which is like extremely fascinating and interesting to listen to, and especially in the 70s, used a lot of absurdity and electronics, but then like really moves in a lot of different directions. But Miharu Koshi's album is actually an ode to French chanson. So there's this idea of like a standard repertory too that like that maybe sometimes is really valued by particular in particular moments, right? Where you're thinking about what is form or what is the structure that's being responded to or improvised over as something different than when you're thinking through like free jazz and sort of the rules and expectations from free jazz as a genre. So when people are covering jazz standards, right, they're singing in reference to other performances, other canonic performances of those standards, right, of which like her interpretation of the standard is one of the most important performances in the 20th century, right? And so here you have someone who's like kind of performing themselves into a canon of French songs, right? But coming from a Japanese perspective. And so like there's a way in which like women are kind of often placed in this role of sort of being bearers of a certain kind of tradition, but not necessarily creating or being composers, right? That I think happens, that sort of brings out. And I think that that's related to this question of like genre as a force shaping new musical movement. We have a thirst for something new, right? Audiences like to feel like they're hearing something special, and newness is one category of special. And so I see a lot of times falling back on this big category, you might even call it like an omnivorous category of improvised music, as a way to kind of open the doors a little bit more. So I don't know if that's something other people notice, looking at just like when people want to back away from jazz, they seem to go to improvise, right? And something like this can be harder to name as improvised, whereas like I see a lot of like world music genres becoming really, really important, or like in some of the programs in recent years, there's like various pop musics engaging with like Afrofuturist technologies, right, that are become a part of the jazz festival because they're improvised, not because they're necessarily related to this history of jazz.
Yeah.
We have one question. Do it. Take this question from the room.
Hi, my name is Lauren. Nice to meet you all. It's lovely to be with you today. I actually want to comment on what Andrea said about how women are, the bearers of these cultural forms and dominating music, and much more capable of creating their own genre. But I actually feel like, women being these bearers and holders of these roles, that basically is very close proximity to active space with genre rather than fairly. And so I was wondering if there's some of how we feel that as bearers that brings them much close to it and able to achieve it, or does it feel like due to other gender and social limits that says restricted? Because I myself often I don't, I acknowledge that social roles really do shape gender roles and how gender is perceived in society, but I always kind of wonder how much that actually limits people's capabilities. So it's a thought.
Okay, let me try and paraphrase that for the Zoom audience. Yeah, so the question is a little bit, just to try, and I won't capture it all, and I apologize, but it's really sort of to say, well, thinking about maybe a close relationship between history that happens from being a bearer of the tradition and how that impacts how that is both a possibility and a constraint for what people can do. And maybe we can take it, of course, there's a way in which that is gendered, and even like thinking about social divisions, like women as caretakers or working in to sustain social life, and then casting that's a common binary, right? But we could cast it along other vectors as well, not just because I think history plays such a strong role in all of the conversation that we've been having. So it's, what is that? Where's that loyalty coming from? Here maybe is another way.
Yeah.
I just wanna, it's not entirely addressing the question, which I think, something that is really worth deep thought. But just wanted to comment that in the way that women are treated, I guess, in the jazz sphere, I think it actually very much replicates classical. Comes to mind is it's a very interesting essay. I forget the scholars who wrote it, but it's an essay that explores women performers in the concert halls in the 19th century. It's called Women Performers and Their Male Critics. And in a way, kind of really gets into that question of women as being, the bearers of somebody else's creativity, right? They're kind of pigeonholed into this role of a performer, which in itself is not understood as having a kind of creative capacity necessarily. And again, I mean, this so many quotes from critics from the 19th century who are actually commenting much more about, a woman's appearance on stage, what they're wearing, how comporting themselves, the physical attributes. But what's interesting about that essay is that, in the 19th century, this is where, the rise of virtuosity and actually the idea of performer. And maybe this kind of can tie it up to this idea of constraint and potential, right? This idea of the performer is actually on the rise, right? And we figured that Francis or Founder, right? All of these kind of new types of geniuses who are, recognize their genius and recognize to their technique, right? And so it's interesting to think about these in juxtaposition, right? You know, on the one hand, yeah, you have this kind of like limitation in a sense, or like a constraint, right? But at the same time, this is the time where this whole concept of where is creativity kind of like migrates from this idea, like somebody like sits and has a beautiful thought into someone who's actually like working their body and working instruments, right?
There's one other slide, I wonder just like I want to look at before we run out of time. You can go down.
Oh, back this way?
Oh, no, sorry.
Oh, forward. Okay.
Yeah.
Oh,
Okay,
wait,
here.
that one?
No,
Oh, this one. Okay.
Yeah, so for me, you know, as someone who works on, you know, a lot of subcultures, youth culture of the 20th century, I was curious to see how hip hop was received by the festival when it's emerging. And this was, I think, the first or one of the first examples in the whole program that I found. This kind of profile of Magnificent Force from 1983. And Jonathan is someone who I know also has a lot of expertise in hip hop. I was just curious, like, is there something significant about this year? Like, I feel like hip hop as a genre did start earlier, but what is about 83 that is it only now getting on German's radar, or specifically on the festival's radar?
It's kind of a mixture of all of those, right? So if we think about hip hop as starting in 1973 and developing into the early 80s, by that point it begins to reach the white mainstream, and that happens transnationally. And one of the ways by which that occurs are a series of films from the early 80s, the first being Wild Style, the second being Style Wars, and the third being Beat Street. It should come as no surprise that Wild Style is 1982, then premieres on German TV in April 1983. This sets off a storm of interest, initially in dance, in breaking, but also brings with it kind of awareness to, again, that national audience. You got to remember, at this time in Germany, there are three TV stations, the first, the second, and then a third regional one. That's it. So you get a lot of eyes there. This, of course, happens on a global level. It's a little bit more in Germany because they actually co-produce the film. But even in the U.S., this is when the fad of breakdancing also comes out. So Germany is not necessarily late to the game in terms of the mainstream population. And sort of transnational spread, but it's riding that wave, and the festival seems to me to be riding on the coattails of that. So they're kind of less leading edge than maybe trying to pick up something that they can bring in.
Okay.
And they do it primarily as dance, not as they're not doing graffiti, they're not doing DJing, and they're not doing rapping, they're doing dance. That's one of the.
Someone asked a question, I think, that's related to this. That's basically looks like there's a lot of cross-cultural and kind of genre-blended performances at the festival. How does that relate to the evolution of the narrative of jazz as a universal language? And what challenges or opportunities arise when you have so much diversity of music traditions or style? Like, I guess that's a question really, like, just does that universal, you know, the idea of the universal or the global music from the 50s and 60s, did that fade into the present, or yeah?
I mean, I think it's still there. So if we're thinking of hip hop, for example, you know, George Grossman's director, when this comes out, talks about connections between jazz and like spoken word, you know, like slam poetry, and then how that is connected to hip hop.
Yeah.
So I think he's seeing jazz as like an element, you know, that's related to hip hop, just that hip hop artists are taking it in a different direction. Another thing I'll say about that, so if you go to the 2 slides before, So you'll see that, for example, this is printed in the 1994 program. So, like 11 years later, it's this hip hop song by Reg E. Gaines called My Air Jordan, right? So here, and I feel like when you listen to this, you can look it up on YouTube. When you listen to it, it's really got that kind of spoken word element to it. Another thing I'll say is that for me, it's, when we're talking about, is jazz, is it popular music or not? Is it freeing or not? A lot of the programs in the 70s and 80s, I feel like there's a certain anxiety about losing them, about not being as commercial, right? So like when rock music blows up, right, in the late 60s, we have like the Stones and the Who and all those bands that are selling out arenas. It's getting harder to compete, right? Like record labels aren't as interested, young people aren't as interested. So the way hip hop seems to be like an opportunity, right? Like, oh, okay, if this is what the kids are into, we're gonna show them there's a connection to jazz. And so like,
Yeah, I think also in 1989, because of the end of communism in Europe, what you have is a kind of revolution is good. Revolution is like a good history, and it's not counterculture. And so one of the things I see is that they start adding film festival to the festival, and a lot of those films are about jazz participating in social and political revolution elsewhere. So jazz really important in South Africa, and as part of the movement to end apartheid. And so there are film screenings about. And I think that's a really interesting way in which, like, this sort of like coattail, like, do you ride the coattails of some of the ways in which youth subcultures are connecting to the genre to bring it in and redefine yourself. That's kind of what I hear you saying.
Yeah, definitely. I know we only have a minute left, but what you're saying, just, at breakfast this morning, we were talking about like the prevalence of hip hop today in terms of popularity. Like, as someone who grew up on rock music, I'm always surprised at how it doesn't seem to be as popular. But I was thinking there's a book about 1989 as like a historical moment, but also a mythical moment, and like the emergence of Nirvana.
Yeah.
I'm wondering, like, is it more of a question about like which genres get attached to revolution?
Yeah.
And then are popular during revolutionary moments? Like, is right now just not a revolutionary moment? Like we're not just fighting populism, right? Or like trying to save democracy. Is that, playing into what music genres are? But I guess we get huge questions. Sorry, so I'm gonna end on this like existential question. But anyway, thank you so much for your attention, for your questions. Thank you.